Forget what the morning headlines are telling you about the Gulf of Oman, because what Iran executed against the United States Navy between 0143 and 0827 local time this morning is not another link in a long chain of escalations. It is not a probing strike. It is not a demonstration package. It is a strategic inflection point that the Pentagon has spent 20 years insisting was operationally impossible. And by the time I am done walking you through what occurred in those 6 hours and 44 minutes, you are going to understand exactly why every foundational assumption underlying American carrier-based power projection collapsed in a single coordinated engagement window against the USS Gerald R and her embarked strike group. 1,000 Shahab 3 ballistic missiles launched in 4 sequenced waves against a carrier strike group operating approximately 220 nautical miles east of the Strait of Hormuz. Not a saturation probe, not a coercion signal. 1,000 missiles inbound against the most expensive single warfighting platform ever constructed, a vessel the United States Navy has marketed for a decade as the embodiment of integrated defensive survivability. As of 0834 this morning, the Ford is dead in the water, approximately 180 nautical miles from the nearest friendly port. Critical propulsion damage. Flight deck operations suspended. The embarked air wing unable to recover. A complement of approximately 9,700 sailors and airmen, the carrier herself, plus her escorts, plus the embarked Marine detachment, in a tactical situation that the people in the Pentagon Situation Room are describing in language I have not heard applied to an American naval formation in my entire career. Sit with that for a moment. I have spent decades analyzing carrier survivability assumptions. I have sat through the briefings where the Ford class was described as the most defensively sophisticated surface combatant ever to put to sea. I have watched in classified spaces the war games where this exact scenario was modeled and dismissed as a planning curiosity rather than a credible operational threat. What Iran executed this morning is not the work of a regional adversary lashing out beyond its means. This was a saturation doctrine applied with operational precision against a defensive architecture that was mathematically incapable of resolving the threat picture. And the math was settled before the first interceptor ever left a rail. This is not a story about one ship being hit by missiles. This is a story about what happens when an entire strategic posture is built on an assumption that the adversary studied, published openly, and waited 2 decades to disprove. The carrier did not lose to Iran this morning. The carrier lost to a set of beliefs about its own invulnerability that nobody inside the institution was willing to seriously challenge while there was still time to change the architecture. That is the analysis I am offering you, and that is the analysis that will matter long after the immediate news cycle has moved on. Let me be specific about what 1,000 Shahab 3 missiles represents in this engagement, because the technical press is going to throw the number around without explaining why 1,000 changes the operational calculus in a way that 900 or 800 would not have. The Shahab 3 in its current production configuration carries a warhead in the 750 to 1,200 kilogram class, a range envelope of approximately 2,000 kilometers, and in its modernized terminal phase executes a maneuvering re-entry profile that defeats the predictive intercept geometry the Aegis combat system was originally designed around. The circular error probable against a moving naval target is now assessed at 30 to 50 meters. For those of you who did not spend years in carrier defense analysis, let me translate. A Ford-class strike group's layered air defense, the SM-3 for exo-atmospheric intercepts, the SM-6 for endo-atmospheric area defense, the Evolved Sea Sparrow for inner ring, the Rolling Airframe Missile for point defense, and the Phalanx Sea Whiz for terminal engagement, is built on an assumption that incoming threats arrive in waves the integrated fire control system can resolve within its combined magazine depth. The combined magazine depth of a full Ford strike group operating at full readiness with 2 Ticonderoga cruisers and 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers, is somewhere between 450 and 550 interceptors. 1,000 inbound ballistic threats is not a saturation challenge. It is an arithmetic impossibility resolved at the level of inventory before it is ever resolved at the level of engagement. And here is why that matters, and stay with me because this is the part that almost every commentator is going to miss. Iran did not launch 1,000 missiles to hit the ford 1,000 times. Iran launched 1,000 missiles to exhaust the interceptor inventory of the strike group in the first 3 waves, and then arrive with the residual force against a defensively naked formation. That is not improvised escalation. That is doctrine. And that doctrine has been published openly in Iranian military journals for over 15 years. We knew the playbook. We chose to assume the launch infrastructure could never execute it at this scale, against a moving target at this distance. This morning, that assumption died in a 4-wave engagement that proved every element of the doctrine was operational. Carrier strike group survivability has always derived from 2 qualities working together. And this is the principle every serious student of naval power must internalize. The first quality is the magazine depth of the layered defense, the actual physical inventory of interceptors available to engage incoming threats across all 5 defensive rings. The second quality is the engagement cycle time, the speed at which the integrated fire control system can identify, classify, prioritize, assign, fire, and assess each individual threat. Remove either one of those qualities and the other becomes insufficient. Infinite interceptors with a broken engagement cycle is a fleet of expensive launchers firing into empty sky. Infinite engagement cycle speed with an exhausted magazine is a sensor network watching threats arrive that it can no longer touch. The strike group needs both to function as a defensive system. Iran did not have to defeat both. Iran only had to defeat one, and by exhausting the magazines through sustained sequenced volleys, the engagement cycle speed became irrelevant. You can resolve a threat picture perfectly and still die if you have nothing left to fire. The targeting package this morning was not one ship. It was 3 simultaneous categories of effect, and the sequencing tells you everything about the level of planning that went into the engagement. The first wave, approximately 280 missiles, launched between 0143 and 0231, targeted the outer escort screen, the Arleigh Burkes operating as the strike group's forward area air defense layer. That wave was not designed primarily to sink ships. It was designed to bleed the SM-3 inventory of the outer destroyers down to operationally meaningless levels. The second wave, approximately 340 missiles, launched between 0247 and 0359, targeted the inner defensive ring and bled the SM-6 magazine to functional exhaustion across the cruisers. The third wave, approximately 240 missiles launched between 0418 and 0537, targeted the Ford herself with terminal maneuvering profiles against a strike group that had already committed the overwhelming majority of its interceptor inventory and was now relying on close-in weapon systems against ballistic threats those systems were never designed to engage. The fourth wave, approximately 140 missiles launched between 0612 and 0827, arrived against an effectively undefended formation and delivered the kinetic effects that have left the Ford in the condition she is in this morning. That is, a sequenced saturation package executed across 6 hours and 44 minutes against the most defensively capable surface combatant in the history of naval warfare, by an adversary the Pentagon has spent 2 decades describing as incapable of coordinated long-range strike at this scale. The people who built that targeting timeline understood the magazine depth. They understood the engagement cycle times. They understood the reload at sea limitations that prevent vertical launch cells from being replenished in a combat environment. They understood exactly how to pace the waves so that each volley arrived against weaker defenses than the one before it. This was not a brute force application of mass. This was the application of mass calibrated to a specific defensive ceiling, with margin built in for interceptor effectiveness and atmospheric variation. The fingerprints of 2 decades of patient analysis are on that timeline. The timing of the opening salvo at 0143 was not coincidence, and it was not convenience. Having served in environments where these decisions get analyzed at the operational level, I can tell you that 0143 was chosen because of three specific conditions converging at exactly that moment. At 0143, the Ford's Combat Direction Center was in mid-cycle watch rotation, the period when personnel are at their lowest cognitive load and threat resolution timelines extend measurably. At 0143, the embarked air wing was in deck-spotted maintenance configuration, with combat air patrol reduced to 2 FA-18 Super Hornets, and the E-2D Hawkeye that extends the strike group's radar horizon was refueling at low altitude in a degraded sensor posture. At 0143, the atmospheric ducting conditions over the Gulf of Oman produce a measurable degradation in long-range radar resolution against low-angle ballistic threats from the northwest bearing, a condition published in unclassified maritime meteorological literature for decades, and which the targeting package clearly accounted for. None of this is secret. All of it has been available to anyone with the discipline to read open-source naval literature. The question was never whether Iran could identify the vulnerability window. The question was whether Iran had the launch infrastructure to exploit it across a multi-hour engagement. This morning we got our answer, and it is worse than the timeline alone suggests, because the strike group was not passive once those threats appeared on the screens. The Ford's defensive architecture performed almost exactly as designed. The Aegis combat systems on the escorts acquired the first wave inside expected parameters. SM-3 launches commenced within the engagement cycle the doctrine specifies. The probability of kill per interceptor against the first two waves was within published assessments. The strike group did not fail because it was incompetent. The strike group failed because doing everything right was no longer enough. That is the doctrinal payoff I want you to hold on to, because it is the lesson that will outlive this engagement. Tactical excellence cannot compensate for a structural mismatch between magazine depth and inbound mass. The system performed at its design ceiling. The design ceiling was the problem. The strike group's command did attempt the most sophisticated response available to a force in this situation. Recognizing in the second wave that magazine exhaustion was approaching faster than the threat picture was being resolved, the Carrier Strike Group commander ordered the embarked FA-18s to attempt offensive interdiction against the launch infrastructure itself. The same logic that underlies every modern long-range air defense doctrine: kill the archer rather than the arrow. That decision was tactically coherent. 2 Super Hornets airborne over the Gulf of Oman, vectored toward identified launch corridors in western Iran, supported by hastily reconstituted tanker tracks and degraded E-2D coverage. It was the correct response within the constraints available, and under conditions where the adversary's launch infrastructure was consolidated, it might have changed the trajectory of the engagement. It was not enough this morning, and the reason it was not enough is the part of the analysis that should keep every carrier task force commander in the United States Navy awake tonight. Iran's launch infrastructure was not consolidated. It was distributed across a launch geometry spanning more than 800 kilometers of dispersed, mobile, and hardened sites, supported by redundant fire control nodes, and designed from the ground up with the assumption that a portion of the architecture would be struck during the engagement window. Striking a fraction of the launch sites did not collapse the engagement because the engagement had been designed to survive exactly that response. 2 Super Hornets, however well flown, against a distributed launch architecture purpose-built to absorb counter-battery fire is not a kill chain. It is an honorable gesture. And the strike group commander knew it was an honorable gesture even as he ordered it, because by that point in the engagement, every option remaining was an honorable gesture. This is the moment naval doctrine fears most. The carrier commander faced a cruel geometry, and I want to be precise about it. Hold station and continue to fight the engagement from a fixed defensive posture, watching the magazines empty against waves that kept arriving. Or break the strike group formation and attempt to maneuver the high-value unit out of the engagement envelope at flank speed, abandoning the coordinated defensive geometry that gave the Ford whatever residual protection remained. Neither option restored the one thing the strike group had already lost, which was the ability to outlast the inbound mass. Holding station meant absorbing the fourth wave against empty magazines. Breaking formation meant taking the carrier out of the only defensive architecture that had any chance of resolving the remaining threats. Both paths ended in the condition the Ford is in this morning. The geometry was decided long before the strike group entered the box. It was decided when 1,000 was selected as the volley size against a magazine depth that maxed out at 550. I want you to understand what 9,700 stranded American service personnel means as a strategic condition, because this is where the consequences extend beyond one ship and into something that changes the entire human picture of American power projection. The Gerald R. Ford carries approximately 4,500 sailors and airmen. Her escort vessels, 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, carry approximately 2,400 more. The embarked Marine detachment, the supply ship complement, and the attached logistics elements bring the total complement to approximately 9,700 personnel. Those personnel are this morning onboard vessels with degraded propulsion, degraded power generation, degraded damage control capacity, and degraded medical infrastructure, approximately 180 nautical miles from the nearest friendly port, in waters where the launch infrastructure that just engaged them remains operational and aimed. The recovery operation that will be required to bring those personnel home is unlike anything the United States Navy has conducted since the Second World War. The logistical complexity, the force protection requirements, the diplomatic coordination, the political optics of an American carrier strike group requiring rescue are factors that the National Command Authority is processing this morning under time pressure that I can tell you from experience produces decisions of categorical strategic consequence. And the situation extends still further because the loss of the Ford as a functional warfighting platform is simultaneously detonating crises that have been managed for 40 years on the assumption that this exact scenario was operationally impossible. The deterrent architecture underwriting American security commitments from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western Pacific just demonstrated in real time in front of every intelligence service on the planet that it could be defeated by a regional adversary using ballistic weapons that have been in service for over 2 decades. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil transits daily, is now operating without the carrier cover that has guaranteed its passage since 1980. Brent crude opened in Asian trading at levels not seen in the lifetime of anyone currently trading the contract. The forward American assets in Bahrain, in Qatar, in the UAE are operating without the air wing umbrella the Ford was providing. The Allied formations operating in coalition with the strike group are conducting independent withdrawal calculations under conditions their doctrine never contemplated. The credibility of American security guarantees to Taiwan, to South Korea, to Japan, to the Baltic states is being recalculated this morning in every capital that has spent decades organizing its national security policy around the assumption that the carrier was the constant. The carrier is not the constant anymore. There is a tendency when something like this happens to immediately reach for the consoling frame, to insist that this was a one-time event, that the conditions cannot be replicated, that the lessons can be absorbed and the architecture restored. I want to caution against that instinct because it is exactly the same instinct that produced the assumptions that died this morning. Every adversary on the planet that has spent the last 20 years watching the United States Navy operate around the carrier as the centerpiece of American power projection is this morning recalculating what is possible. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force does not need to be told what 1,000 ballistic missiles against a Ford class did. The Russian General Staff does not need a briefing on the implications. The North Korean missile program does not need a translation. Every state actor with a ballistic missile inventory and a coastline within reach of an American carrier track line, has spent this morning studying the timeline, the wave structure, the magazine math, and the engagement cycle limitations that produce this outcome. The doctrine is now proven. The proof is being studied. The next adversary to apply it will do so with confidence the Iranians could only theorize about before this morning. The broader lesson here is not that the carrier is obsolete. The broader lesson is about assumptions, and specifically the danger of assumptions that have not been tested against the actual conditions of the present-day battlefield. The United States Navy assumed that the depth of its layered defenses was sufficient against any realistically projectable threat. The depth was sufficient against the threats projected. The threats projected were not the threats that arrived. The Navy assumed that no regional adversary possessed the launch infrastructure, the targeting fidelity, and the doctrinal patience to apply saturation at the scale necessary to defeat the architecture. Iran possessed all three, demonstrated all three, and the demonstration is now part of the historical record from which every future adversary will plan. The Navy assumed that the offensive reach of the embarked air wing would always provide the option of striking the Archer before the arrows exhausted the defenders. The Archer was distributed beyond the reach of two Super Hornets, and the air wing's offensive reach was never reconfigured for distributed counter-battery against a 1,000-launcher architecture. The assumptions that the Ford operated under this morning were the assumptions that made her vulnerable, not because they were obviously wrong in isolation, but because they had not been updated to account for what this battlefield had become. Modern naval warfare is no longer defined primarily by the displacement of a hull or the sortie generation rate of an air wing. It is defined by the relationship between defensive magazine depth and adversary offensive mass, and by the resilience of distributed launch architectures against counter-battery responses that were optimized for a different era of conflict. A strike group that enters contested waters with confidence, built on doctrine that has not been pressure tested against present-day adversary capability, is not projecting strength. It is projecting opportunity. And on a battlefield where patient, organized, technically precise forces have spent 2 decades preparing for exactly that kind of opportunity, the distance between a confident forward presence and a catastrophic loss can be measured in a single engagement window. What this engagement ultimately demonstrated is not that the United States Navy lacks capable equipment or trained personnel. The crews of the Gerald R. Ford and her escorts performed with the discipline and the technical competence that the institution has built across generations. The combat systems performed at the upper bounds of their design envelopes. The strike group commander made the decisions the doctrine called for at the moments the doctrine called for them. None of that was the variable that decided the engagement. The variable was the gap between what the institution believed about its own survivability and what the adversary had constructed to disprove that belief. Closing that gap will not be a matter of building more interceptors or laying down a new class of escorts or distributing the air wing across additional platforms. It will require a reckoning with the foundational assumption that the carrier strike group, in its current configuration, can survive the threat environment that this morning's engagement has now defined as the operative reality. The Ford is dead in the water. The magazines are empty. The 9,700 will come home because the United States Navy will move every asset it has to bring them home, and I want to say plainly that I believe they will come home. But the platform class they were serving on will not return to the operational role it occupied yesterday because the role itself was built on an assumption that no longer holds. The decisions made in the White House Situation Room, in the Pentagon, in Allied capitals across 3 continents in the next 24 to 48 hours will define American naval power for the next generation in ways the decisions of every previous week of this conflict have not. How many other formations are operating this morning under assumptions that the events of the last 6 hours and 44 minutes have already disproven? How many commanders and how many fleets are still calculating risk using frameworks that were built for an era of conflict that ended at 0143 local time today? At what point does an alliance system built on the projection of one specific capability have to confront the loss of that capability as the new strategic reality rather than a recoverable tactical setback? And how quickly can the lessons of one morning in the Gulf of Oman be absorbed by the institutions and the navies that will face similar conditions in the conflicts ahead before another strike group enters another contested box under the same assumptions that left the Ford where she is this morning? The questions do not have simple answers. The silence over the Gulf of Oman this morning is the sound of an era ending. And what comes next will not look like anything this conflict or any conflict since the end of the Cold War has produced.